spinning up your initial project and then opening it in your IDE, you'll see this project structure, and then you'll have your resources, and then your application.yaml will be inside the resources, and then inside POM file, a number of dependencies that we'll have here as highlighted on our docs. So we'll have these JWT API, JWT implementation, and this Jackson to enable us now create the JWT tokens. So let's first start to run this app and see if everything will run as expected. Yeah, so started on port 8080. Yeah, Tomcat started. So you can see Tomcat started on port 8080. It means our app is up and running. So we can open this application.yaml to now set our database connection. So here we go. So these are the dependencies that we have just added. So you can configure our database. So remember, our database has this username and password that we spinned up on Docker. So we'll just have all these in our database. So you can just copy this. You can just copy this, or rather we can do it bit by bit as we go through it. So this is what I'll do. So inside here, we can start from setting the server port. So you can just say here we need a server port. So in YAML, this is what you do with indentation. Then you say server port will be 8001, whichever port that is available on your machine. And then you say Spring application name is service auth service demo. The first item that we'll need to set in here is the Hibernate, and also set our Postgres database connection. So we'll start with setting, so we'll come here on the second, on the first indentation. So we first want to set the JPA, then secondly we'll set the data source, those two, and then we'll proceed with the rest. So in JPA, so some items that we'll set here, for example, there is this open in view. First, the default is true, so we'll put this one to false. So what this basically tells JPA is that specifically it disables the Open Entity Manager in our view. So this by default on Spring Boot is enabled. So when it's true, by default, it tells a JPA Entity Manager that it should keep the Hibernate session open for the entire duration of the HTTP request. So this will include a view rendering phase and all that. So it's kind of something like transactional, which doesn't really a service method without encountering a lazy initialization exception. So it's just like basically telling Hibernate to keep this connection open for the entire transaction. But now for us, we want to keep it also so that it can close. And then the second item that I'll set is, I'll set also properties here, another object, or rather dictionary, which will have properties. And then I'll say Hibernate. So I want to set the Hibernate dialect, which I'll set it to, let me first do this. I'll say it's Hibernate.dialect, and then I want PostgreSQL dialect. So let me see my spelling. This Hibernate PostgreSQL dialect. I think that's correct. Then in here, after that, I'll just say Hibernate, then set DDL auto. I'll set it to update. So this couple of these two items is first for dialect. We tell Hibernate that basically use these particular dialect, or rather use this specific variant of SQL dialect to generate the optimized database specific queries. So because Hibernate is database agnostic, but different databases, say MySQL or Postgres or Oracle, they have minor variation in terms of how you're writing their SQL statements and the standards that are there. So we are just specifying that we are using Postgres, so it will Hibernate will automatically optimize our SQL queries into Postgres specific for Postgres. And then the last one for this one that we said, for this one update, for DLL auto update, this is Hibernate's data definition language, the DLL. So it will determine the DLL generation behavior. So by update, we say that when the application starts now, Hibernate will try to compare our models that we have, or rather our entity that we have defined using those annotation like the entity annotation, and then it will attempt to update our schema, or rather our database columns and constraint, to just make sure that they align with what we have on our definitions. So that's for the first part of setting Hibernate. So the second phase was to set now our data source. So let's go to our data source and point to our database. So in this next line, we'll just say our database, we want to have to set the URL. That's the first one. That will say this will be a JDBC connection that is PostgreSQL, and then so this is the URL to our database that's here. And so we'll say this one will go to localhost. So remember what we did on Docker. We opened port 5432 on our Docker, and then we'll now pick the database that we had set. For example, in our case, we had set it to what was it? Yeah, so we had set it to Bula POS and then password, and this is, let me just confirm what we did on our Postgres. Yeah, so dev Postgres, no. So we said master DB, so that's what we need to enter here and say master DB, and then we'll also add our username now. Let's say add our username, and then username was Sam if I remember well, and then we'll just say our password is, so we just come back here and confirm our password was this one, Sam123, and our user is Sam. So having that, we have defined our data source, and lastly we can just highlight the driver class name to ensure that this connection is using org.postgresql.driver. That's a specific driver that we want to use to connect. And then that's it. So we have successfully connected to our database. So let's try to rerun our app and see what we got. It will still run. So by still running, it means it should automatically attempt to connect to our database. And so once that is successful, then our app will still be up and running. And so that's how we do our configuration. And you can see started on port this one. So our app is still up and running. That means we have successfully connected to our database. So let's proceed to the next step, where now we start our configuration, and we start to do we now start adding meat into our project, since we have successfully connected to the database, and now we need to code our logic now.